This is Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley. I'm the fellow who has a hyphen in my name. The hyphen is silent, but I am anything but that. This morning, we're going to be talking about culture. Respectonomics is co-hosted by Jeremy Wentworth-Stanley and Sarah Benton, and we're going to be looking at culture from a number of points of view. It's a word that is used very freely. It's a word that's used in different settings. You hear it used in the world of art. You hear it used in organizations. You hear it in faith organizations as well. It's a word widely used. We want to use respectonomics to bring out some of the understandings about culture, some of its risks, some of its rewards, and how we can use culture to improve the relationships that we have one human being to another.
Excellent. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning.
Fabulous topic. I absolutely love the topic of culture. I think it's very broad and covers so many different facets. And like you said, can be applied to corporate world. It's within the religious communities. It is within communities itself. It's even within families. So fantastic topic for us to be covering today. So when you speak of culture, like you say, it can be quite a broad definition. Often it's associated with shared values, beliefs, behaviors, practices. In terms of respectonomics, what do you define culture to mean?
Well, I'll deal with the definition of culture, which is it's a sort of trident. It's got three prongs to it. Culture is defined as having knowledge. It's a concept of belief and a concept of behavior. And all three come together. And one of the difficulties, of course, with that expression, that definition of knowledge, belief, and behavior, we could talk about each one significantly for a long.
Absolutely. Yes. We could go very in depth into each of those components.
I think in itself, that is one of the great risks, that when you get into the world of culture, it's very easy to get down these rabbit holes and so on. What I want to explore, and I'd like you to help me on this, please, is if we believe in the general principle of one human being dignifying and respecting another, which I think is the central theme to respectonomics. If that is the case, what we need to do is to examine what cultural orbit does this expression take place the best, number one. And number two, and to me is the question that I struggle with significantly, is can we change cultures?
Interesting.
So let's talk first of all, perhaps, and I'd like your opinion on this, is just understanding the world of culture and how it influences our behavior and how we imply knowledge and our beliefs to the whatever arrangements we're having, whether it's a business world or a social world. I think for the purposes of this podcast, we should focus our cultural discussion on the corporate.
Yes.
I mean, that takes up probably 60% of people's lives anyway. And having said that, the corporate world extends to the other ones as well in terms of content and style.
Yes. And it's quite interesting. When it comes to culture, it's almost, how do I say this for lack of better words? In some corporate environments, it's the trendy thing to do. To say that we have culture, this is what our culture is. One of the challenges that comes across when you're talking about culture is, like you say, one is defining what culture means, what the culture is to that particular environment, how it is imparted, and then also, is it just a language or an umbrella that overhangs over the corporate world, or is it something that is actually implemented? Right. It's one thing to say that we have culture and here's what our culture is, but
at the risk of being facetious.
Yes.
I came off with this little sort of almost one of those schoolboy jokes of what do inflation and culture have in common? And it's not a schoolboy joke. It's a deeply serious question, because if I go by what I read in the financial press about the rate of inflation, I know that the figure is roughly 2.156832.9%. You know how they
Roughly.
roughly exactly, but it's a key point. Then how do you explain the price of gasoline up 30%? How do you explain the price of vegetables up 20% and beef prices up 40% and these outrageous increases? And then you get this government regulatory figure that actually makes no sense to what we're doing, our real world. And I have a feeling that culture is very much the same risk. We are told what the culture is. And I think we, as the canaries in the mine, we know that that culture is not what it is stated to be. And as a matter of fact, I have a horrible feeling culture is used as a sort of almost like a password that says we have a great corporate culture or we have a great political culture. And when you really get down to it, you find out lots and lots of words. And we all run this risk of lots and lots of words. Respectonomics runs the risk of lots and lots of words. What we have to come to grips with is, where is the individual? How does that culture really, really influence and integrate with that real person's life?
Right.
I think there's been a lot of weakness in that area. I was talking to somebody who I believe is an accredited corporate executive. He's retired. Extensive knowledge, both from a operational point of view and from an investment banking as well.
Right.
He's seen the waterfront. And I asked him, I said, how do you change the culture of a corporation? And his answer was fascinating. He said, you get rid of the people.
People meaning
the people who are
leaders
or the leaders.
Yes. Yeah.
It's an incredibly ingrained problem. And you in your line of work, I believe, and you can comment on this, you have seen many mission statements and goals and objectives and all of these things. And I think from what you've told me, a lot of it is ticking the box.
Yes. Well, if you think about culture and some of the components that it can cover, like I say, it can be inclusive of when a company or a corporation decides or an organization decides to define culture. It could be talking about including components of fostering employee engagement and satisfaction. And we all know that a lot of companies or businesses, corporations do employee satisfaction surveys in addition to client surveys. Yeah. And as you just said, it's what happens after we've ticked the boxes to say, well, we did our survey. It's what are you doing to then engage what some of the challenges or concerns that arose out of those issues. It can involve brand identity, which it can also look at aligning organizational goals with what the culture is. I think the challenges, like you said, is how does that get implemented and what's the impact?
Well, I think the starting gate is, in order to engage a culture, I think the first thing you have to do is to understand that the culture is created by human beings. It's not something that's created by the manufacturing or the plant or the resources the physical resources that are used. The culture is very much of a human origin.
So what's the objective? What's the objective of culture?
Well, if we go over the centuries, and I mean literally go over the history book, culture has been incredibly important to the evolutionary growth of the population and the way that we do things differently. Go back to the UK, for example, in the 1960s, the economy was in terrible trouble. It's also when you saw this sort of cultural revolution. That's what Beatles and all these other people sort of came to the table. By the way, do you know the definition of culture? A cultured person. Now, this is going to be
I was going to say those are two different things.
I know, but the older listener has to hear this one.
Let's go.
A cultured person is the one who can tell the difference between the theme tune to the Lone Ranger and the William Tell Overture. They're the same.
That's the definition. Okay, I like it.
But anyway, no, seriously, the problem with this whole cultural thing is we need culture. It's the sort of umbrella. It's a framework. Yes. And I think, frankly, a lot of lip service has been given to culture. And if it isn't lip service, it falls into what you're talking about, where the boxes were ticked, we did the survey, everybody's satisfied, and all of that file ends up in the top left-hand drawer somewhere. In other
Right.
words, nothing actually becomes implemented out of it. To me, there are two major aspects to culture, and this is very much a respectonomics, call it philosophy. The first one is that if I'm going to recognize the culture stems from the human being, then I
Yes.
have to be intellectually honest and say that the human being does represent the body, the physicality of the person, the mind, which is the processing agent, and the soul, which is the operating system. You need all of those three to be integrated when you look at the culture, number one.
Mm-hmm.
Number two, I think that culturally speaking, every organization needs to be able to examine the relationship that they have with the individual, number one, and that in itself is almost, what would you call it, breakthrough material.
Mm-hmm.
How often do people act organizationally? How often does the organization say, does our culture work with these individuals, with these human beings? And I'm
Mm-hmm.
not sure that question is necessarily asked or taken seriously. I'm not sure.
Right.
I think your experience doesn't happen very often.
Yes. Like I say, I think the label of culture, or like you say, that umbrella, you've created that framework of how you'd like the company to be run, values, beliefs, branding,
Yeah.
collaboration, acquiring of talent, all those types of things. But it's a matter of then, are you actually, and how are you actually instilling that culture
Okay.
and maintaining that culture, developing that culture, so it reflects what the words are on the paper?
Yes. And I think you have to be didactic about it, meaning you have to be very careful to look at the human being. That, after all, is who we're talking about.
Yes.
Does this culture work fit? Does it expand? Does it amplify? Does it allow the giftedness of the individual to flourish?
And how do they do that?
And I think the first part of we have this grid, which we'll be discussing in another podcast, but we have the grid that shows that every human being has certain necessities. We know that I need water, I need food, I need shelter, I need light, I need people. I need those are the things just for the essence of living. I
Right.
need
The
those.
basics.
Absolutely
The
basic.
staples. The staples.
So then you take the staples and then you say to the corporation, let's take a look then at that individual, those basic requirements, and look at the corporate's responsibility to the body of that individual, to the mind of the individual, and the soul of the individual. What are we doing that engages, encompasses, embroids those basic needs for that individual? That, I think, is the heart of the culture. And the second part that goes with that cultural, what you might call engagement, is as much as the corporation is now looking at how do I support the body of this human being. Well, in terms of, if you said food, then you might say wages. So are you paying your people properly for the value of their work? I think you've indicated to me that you are aware of where similar work done hasn't always been paid fairly or equitably.
Right.
I think you.
Which that's a whole other podcast and conversation
Absolutely.
as well.
But it still comes down to the
Absolutely.
issue of looking at what we're doing there is, if we take food as being the allegory or the analogy, is the corporation feeding the employee, the staff people? Are they feeding it appropriately? Are they feeding the mind properly? Are they feeding the soul properly? And, some of these, the risk with this conversation is that corporations are so quick to say, oh, we don't worry about that. But then once you say you don't worry about that, then what part do you not worry about? And what is your right to disentangle the human being? The human being is made up of these three parts. If somebody can prove to me there's three different parts that I haven't thought, tell us.
I really like, though, how Respectonomics takes analogies. So, for example, like you say, it's kind of a basic need, the food, and equating that to something that a company or a corporation would understand.
Yeah.
right? So it's connecting the dots. And
Yeah.
so I like how you do the comparisons and analogies in order for from the thought-provoking standpoint for them to understand
Well, I
how
think
to.
when you think of it, so many of the examples we give in life are what you'd call metaphorical. They are,
Yes.
we talk about something is, it's as hot as or it's as cold as. If I told you that the actual temperature was, minus 14 degrees or something, it doesn't tell you as much as saying, actually, it's so cold that,
Right.
the trees were all crackling or something. So
Right.
it's very useful to bring this down to a very, very basic, not even basic, to a foundational basis. And I think there's a risk in culture, a risk in corporate missions, a risk in a lot of our discussions that we start at far too high a level. If we start at the base level, the human being, and I come back to this over and over again, come back to the human being, come back to the essence of the component of the human being and the subtext of that human being, we've got a far better chance of addressing these.
Mm-hmm.
One
Right.
of the two things I want to add to this. One is, if it's true that the corporation has these responsibilities to engage at these various levels, then I, as the employee, have the same obligation to the company to engage them in a similar principle. In other
Right.
words, how am I feeding the corporation?
Reciprocity.
Absolutely. Reciprocity is absolutely, I mean, if you look at the human body, it's all based on reciprocity. Your
Mm-hmm.
heart goes from one side to the other, it goes from beat to rest. You look at your left hand and your right hand. There's a tremendous amount of the corporate, the human being that is in fact reciprocal in its very nature. So
Right.
you shouldn't be surprised at this. All we're pointing out is if I have an issue where I'm asking a company to do something for me, as the who was it? Kennedy said, "Don't ask what the country's doing for you. Ask what you can do for the country. What am
Right.
I doing for the corporation? The corporation, and as much as I do too, we have to be able to accept those interests as well. It's very
Yes.
easy if I go to the corporation and say, I am doing this for you, I need the corporation to look at me and say, I accept what you're doing for me. I don't think corporations, generally speaking, do a very good job of recognizing what the employees do for them. I was reading
Mm-hmm.
yesterday about the demands that a corporation will place upon the individual. We expect you to be working this weekend. I mean, these kinds of demands. Well, yeah, the demands may be there for, business reasons, but it's similarly very important for the corporation to accept that what somebody is giving to the corporation is properly received and accredited. And I don't mean in
Right.
financial terms, I'm talking about straight appreciation.
Right. Valued.
Thank you. Yeah, value.
Right. Employees, individuals want, I mean, in every facet of life,
Right.
you want to feel valued. You want to feel valued by your family. You
Absolutely.
want to feel valued by your community. You want to feel valued
Right.
in your place of employment.
Right.
Yes, definitely
Well,
reciprocal.
I think the other part to it is this. We talk about corporations being living entities. We talk
Hmm.
about that. I mean, you and I have beaten up on this one, but the corporation is based on the Latin corpus, which means a body.
Right.
Well, it doesn't mean corpse. It means
Right.
something that's living and thriving. It's got a beating heart and so on. So it's very important. If we agree on that, it's very important to recognize that the culture also has to be a living organism. It isn't
Yes.
something just sticks. And
It's not stagnant.
and you know how I love taking you to Latin origins
Yes.
and worse still, Greek origins. Well, this is Latin. I promise you, I'm stopping at Latin. But the word culture comes from culturo, which means to cultivate. It's an act of putting seed in the ground or harrowing the ground to put the seed in so that it grows. So the whole concept of a culture is that it's a growing organism. It's not a static,
Hmm.
oh, there's our culture. No, it's a growing culture. It's organic, just as much as the human being is. It's
Right.
evolution. We already said that the key behind culture has been how it's allowed the human race to evolve and to do all these incredible things that we can do today, whether it's an electric car or whether it's,
Hmm.
instant food. All of those things are evolutionary and in many cases came from a cultural desire to improve. But the culture itself is a living organism. It has breath, it has life. And once the culture dies, in other words, it's not moving, it's a, I think in John Cleese's terminology, it is a dead parrot.
Mm.
Once it
It
becomes,
cannot be stationary. It's something that has to constantly
yeah,
be tapped into and constantly evolve, shift, shape,
exactly.
adjust, change
Yeah.
with all the other
Yeah.
variables that are coming at it, right?
So the CEO would correctly say, yes, our culture is to look for the giftedness of the human being, but that's what we're doing at the moment. Our culture is always changing. It's always evolving.
Hmm.
But with that becomes a level of excitement. This isn't a deadpan sort of, those mission statements. I keep going back to those. Most of
Right,
them read very deadly,
right,
almost feel like they're sort of, one step away from a funeral home. What we're talking about here is something that is alive, something that breathes, something, and if it breathes and lives, by my definition, if it lives and breathes, it needs to be fed.
right.
So you need to feed the culture. You need to look at it as something that is an organism that is constantly under care, consideration, and growth. Now, there's another
Absolutely.
side to this. We just said about what happens when a culture dies.
Hmm.
Many respects, what you end up with is a cult. The same root
Hmm.
word, by the way, in Latin,
Hmm.
very, very closely aligned. So to have a culture is one thing, but it can morph into a cult very easily.
And what do you mean by that?
Well, the cult is that horrible thing when you feel that you're in this corporate world or political world or whatever, and the culture is, and there's nothing you can do about it. Go back to the comment I was given, that the culture can only change when the people change. What he
Right.
meant was get rid of the people. That was his actual tenet. I'm saying no. I think we can go far more deeply and profoundly than that by asking the individual to consider the culture and what they can change in their own outlooks and attitudes, values, and so on to bring about that change in culture. I think it's a responsibility for each of us, not only to examine the culture, but to see how we can embroider it, enhance it, improve it.
Right.
I think we should
Well, I
always.
mean, in fairness to organizations as well, that is often what the intention or the concept is of doing those annual surveys to take a temperature, if you will. We're talking about, body to see how people are doing, so sort of on that line of defense, that is the intended purpose of it.
Mhm.
And so that also does rely on those individuals, as you say. It's a reciprocal relationship.
Yeah.
It's a ring where they have to contribute back. So it's also a matter of feeling comfortable enough and also to be honest in the feedback that they're providing.
Well, let's go back to two things. One is you mentioned the annual survey. This isn't an annual exercise.
Hmm.
This is a by the minute.
Right.
I mean,
But
what's
to
that
most
book?
companies, that is the case,
Yeah.
right?
I mean, what's the book? Managing by the minute or minute management or
Mm.
something.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
it's something that I mean, if you're driving along the road, you actually pay attention to the next hydro pole. You don't
You
say,
should be, yes.
should be. And if most of us are aware of the fact that when we've had accidents, it's because we weren't paying attention to the next hydro.
Right.
So in culturally speaking, we need to be very organic, very immediate, very spontaneous, and constantly on the lookout. And do you know how to make the lookout? You look through the windshield at the front, but you look in your rearview mirror as well to see what's coming up from behind. You always do that when you're driving. That's standard issue. But there's another part to this cultural thing that I think we need to explore. If a culture is not organic, and if it is dying, and if it, in fact, let's be more to the point and say it's dead, then you've got a problem and you've heard of people who get involved in cults. And then you get into this huge discussion of how do you deprogram people who are in those cults? And I think that's the job of Respectonomics, is to start deprogramming these almost these cultural foundational, because this is the way it is. I heard of an example very recently that it doesn't matter which business world it was, but in Europe, there is one business that is preeminent in the business it does. Fine. But when North America goes to it and says, here's another way to look at it or to do it, the response is, no, we know what we're doing because we.
Ah,
And how often have
they're
you heard
not open
that?
or receptive to any type of feedback.
No,
So if that's the
no.
case, how are they
Well,
with employees or individuals within the corporation, right?
and it migrates all the way through. I was in a municipal building this morning, and there's been some difficulties. There's traditional, conventional difficulties between one level of the organization and another. And she said something very interesting to me. She said, and it's moving right the way through the organization. So this
What's
cultural impasse at the top is one
mhm,
that actually feeds right the way through to the end. And that end
right?
includes your customers, it includes your shareholders, it includes suppliers, it
Yes,
includes all the myriad of people that are involved in it.
internal and external, right?
Absolutely. You can't
Yeah.
separate the two from each other. So I think we're into a world where the culture in many corporations, I hate to say this, and maybe I'm being a bit cruel, but I think a lot of corporate leadership works on one premise: what's in it for me?
Mm,
And I think that's a terrible shame because the what's in it for me, in fact, becomes a far more successful outcome when I ask a different question of what's in it for you.
right.
When I ask what's in it for you, then we've actually got a chance of bringing forward new prosperities, new ideas. I will put one more thought your way, Sarah, and I want your opinion on
Yes.
this one, particularly
Mhm.
your HR background. But I think a lot of corporations tell you what their culture is, just like we're told what the inflation number is. We know underneath it all that culture is not an accurate expression or portrait. We know that. And what's really frightening, though, for all the gloss and glamour, the wages and all that, I think a lot of employees, a lot of staff people operate under a culture of fear.
I would agree with that comment.
And
Right. I mean, that kind of takes it back to the line or I guess your explanation or your analogy of it of from a cult standpoint,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
You do as you're told,
yeah,
because you might be worried about your productivity numbers. You might be worried about your performance,
yeah,
as we all know. That's a natural thing to be. Performance is part of
yeah,
a job, and that should be expected from an employee standpoint as well as from an employer standpoint. However, I think um, when you operate from a place of fear, right, or
yeah.
worry,
Hmm.
you're operating from a completely different mentality or a different perspective in terms of how you're contributing to an organization or a company. Like you say, that reciprocity piece, as opposed to when you feel valued and you feel comfortable in terms of sharing or engaging
Right.
or contributing, right?
Yeah. I'm exploring that one concept with you, one more step. If we look at a culture of fear as the way you've
Hmm.
described it,
Hmm.
I'm not going to be too keen to put my thoughts forward. My thoughts might be almost rebellious. They might be, confronting the organization. I did actually confront the organization I was with once, and I still,
Hmm.
to this day, remember the answer I was given. Oh, Jeremy, you don't understand.
Mm,
Well, the truth was, I did understand. That was
right.
the truth. And for what it's worth, 5 years later or whatever it wasn't long after, what I had said turned out to be extremely true.
Right. I think that's actually one of the best questions you can ask in any situation or circumstance. It allows room for compassion, empathy, and understanding is help me understand, right? So if somebody's saying, you don't understand, then help me understand your perspective or vantage point. So it's
Well,
a shame they didn't elaborate further. I
well, if I
mean,
had
you
asked
knew
that
you
question,
were
I can,
accurate in that
I
case.
can, yeah, I can cynically come back with the answer on that one because Jeremy, you don't understand. And if I had come back with the confrontational, what is it that I do not understand?
Hmm.
What I would have found out in short order was they didn't understand.
Correct.
It's often been said, by the way, and this is worth knowing culturally, that if you read something or hear something you don't understand, and we've all had that experience, you just,
Yes.
you know, and I'm not talking about running your computer, by the way. That's just a write-off.
Is that directed at me?
That's right. No, it's directed all of you because you fix me up all the time. But no, seriously, when I don't understand something, and I don't know what the statistic is, but apparently it's very, very high. And that is, if I don't understand something, high percentage is the person who authored that statement doesn't understand either.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just reflecting what that person has done. Now, listen, coming back to the cultural part again, though, this business of operating under fear.
Mm-hmm.
If you operate in this process of fear, first of all, it does, I'm afraid, stem from the leadership looking at it, what's in it for me? And when you get into what's in it for me, doesn't take long before that becomes a put down, push down, my way, highway, and people will toe the line because that's what I want for me.
Mm-hmm.
Becomes very dictatorial, in other words.
Yes, I was just going to say actually dictatorial versus collaboration, right?
Exactly. There's the contrast. And then we look at the world of fear for a minute. And this can be proven not only in a business sense, but also psychologically. When people experience a sense of fear, that in fact is what defines their behavior.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm frightened of, let's say, rejection, then I'll take steps to make sure I don't get rejected.
Absolutely.
Fairly obvious, I think.
Right.
And the snag with that is, in that case, I'm withholding information. I'm withholding ideas. So you're losing the benefit of the individual's innovation, the productivity, the nuances,
their skill sets.
Yeah. Have you ever thought of? All of those things get pushed to the side when people operate under this umbrella of fear.
Mm-hmm.
And I think when I talk to a corporation about their culture, there are two things that I think are very important. We typically will say to the corporation or the leadership, this is true in politics, by the way, might even be true in the family unit.
Right.
That is, the question is, so that's your culture, fine. And you say your culture is blah, 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 blah. And your question then is, what are your points of reference? Because without those points of reference, we experience a much more subjective response to things and to our lives. And again, we're back into the what's in it for me.
Right.
If we have terms of reference or points of reference that deal with, these are the points of reference that we work with, we are much more likely to come out with an objective understanding of what our culture can be and should be.
Right.
It's too easy to fall into that prey of me first, and it gets expressed differently. It goes back to that question we had earlier today in this discussion. What's in it for you is a far better question than what's in it for me.
Absolutely. Sure. So based on that, Jeremy, just to wrap up, because I know, again, we could speak on this topic for a long time. Right. In terms of, from a Respectonomics standpoint, solutions, remedies, how can Respectonomics contribute? How can we help? How can we engage?
I think one of the first things we have to come to grips with is in culture is in order to identify the problems. That's the first step. Now, I know that sounds very hackneyed, identify the problem and then we can come up with solutions. But one of the things I've discovered is how incredibly difficult it is to take take the lid off the obvious. What is obvious is actually very difficult to discover. It takes a lot of work and it needs a lot of questioning. And I think Respectonomics, what it does, it constantly dissects our human relationships with one another, the components that come into it, whether it's our memories, whether it's our emotions, whether it's our feelings, whether it's our beliefs, education, knowledge, whatever it might be. But we keep coming back to understanding and dissecting those key points. To answer your point, Respectonomics is a vehicle for coming to grips with this cultural, what would you call it?
Challenge.
challenge. That's a nice way of putting it, but it's a fairly messy situation, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, you only have to look at the political world today to say something's culturally in the wrong place.
Right.
The divisiveness and the hurts and the angers and accusations and all that stuff. Respectonomics deals with one central truth, and that is that it respects the other human being. And in order to do that, the economics of that respect is, and our unit of exchange is dignity.
Right.
When I dignify you, I am far more likely to explore, to understand, and to enjoy your giftedness. And when I know what your giftedness is, then we're in a much better place to bring that giftedness out. Benefits
Mm-hmm.
you, it benefits the business,
Well, and
benefits
value that
humanity.
giftedness. Right. Yeah.
Let's,
I think it relies on some vulnerability for lack
yeah,
of not
yeah,
having another word to express, but it relies on vulnerabilities, like you say, in terms of kind of taking the lid off
mhm,
and having a true, good,
yeah,
solid look at what the
right,
challenges are. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
And allowing ourselves to look at those through that filter of the human being. I've
Mm-hmm.
said this before, and this is my concluding comment, really, that when you look at any economic transaction, and it matters not how complicated it is and how extensive it is, and whether it deals with the balance of payments in China or the value of the Canadian dollar, I don't care what end to end you look at, but you
Mm-hmm.
take that transaction, and I will make you one guarantee. At the beginning of that transaction and at the conclusion of that transaction is one human being.
Right.
So we are central to the process, both from the standpoint of being in the middle, but we are also at the beginning and at the end. And we want the culture to bring those two ends together in a way that we have greater harmony, greater productivity, greater prosperity, greater contentment.
Perfect. What a fabulous way to sum it up.
Thank you.
Great conversation with you today, Jeremy. Thanks so much again.
And thank you, Sarah.
Take care.
Bye then.